Today, we're bringing you a story about one of the worst medical research scandals of the century. A hyped breakthrough meant to revolutionize the way cancer is treated, but it was all based on fraud. The scandal rocked the science world 15 years ago, but there's a piece of the story that hasn't been told before. MIT President Sally Kornbluth was a top dean at Duke Medical School at the time. She helped guide Duke's response as warnings were piling up. And yet, clinical trials based on fraud continued. In this week's Globe magazine cover story, reporter Mike Damiano takes readers inside the scandal that ended with broken careers, betrayed patients, and a lasting legacy of doubt in scientific institutions. I'm Jasmine Aguilera, and this is The Globe. Mike, thanks so much for talking to me.
Hey, Jasmine, thanks for having me.
So, how did you find this story?
Like a lot of stories, it started with a tip to look into Sally Kornbluth's role in this medical research scandal. Sally Kornbluth is, of course, the president of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the top scientific research institutions in the world, and she played a central role in this scandal. She wasn't in the lab. She had nothing to do with doing the research itself, but she was in a leadership role and helped guide Duke's response to this scandal, especially as challenges to this fraudulent research mounted. And the tip was, you should go find out what she knew and when, and what she did with that information. So I went to North Carolina. I went to a courthouse in Durham and found thousands of pages of documents that had been filed in a lawsuit over these fraudulent clinical trials. And these documents had been there literally collecting dust for a decade. And when you open them, this whole story unfolds. Everything is in there. Their emails are in there. Medical records are in there. Memos expressing concern about this research. The sworn testimony of many Duke leaders, including Sally Kornbluth, talking about what they knew and when, and how they deliberated over every decision in this scandal.
So, what was the scandal?
So it started with great promise, which maybe is how a lot of scandals begin. In the early 2000s, there was this new frontier in cancer research technology. There have been great advances in human genome sequencing. And the idea was now that you could analyze patients' DNA to help guide their cancer treatment. And it was more of an idea than something you could actually do. And then this lab at Duke came along. It was the Joe Nevins lab, and his junior researcher was Anil Poti. And they basically claimed to have cracked the code. They claimed to have developed algorithms that could analyze a particular patient's cancer tumor and then spit out the best prediction for which chemotherapy would be the most effective to treat it. This was heralded as a huge breakthrough in cancer research.
How so?
So a lot of oncology involves a lot of guesswork. There's a variety of drugs that can be administered to treat any given cancer. And some people, some tumors will respond more or less to one treatment or another. And oncologists are often left to guess. And these algorithms promised to take the guesswork out. They claimed that they could guide a patient to the right chemotherapy for them with accuracy exceeding 85% in some cases. That's a paradigm shift in oncology. And the cancer research world took it that way. So they published their findings in some of the top scientific journals in the world, and they were a sensation. And they had an internal analysis that showed that there was a potential market of $2 billion to sell these predictors to doctors.
Whoa.
But they had to prove they worked, not just in a lab, not just in scientific papers, with real patients in the real world.
So, what did they do to prove that in the real world?
So they launched 3 clinical trials and enrolled cancer patients in them and described their technology, described these algorithms to the patients. And the patients came to believe that enrolling in these trials may give them the best chance to survive or to extend their lives. So while those trials are underway, warnings start mounting about this technology. And it's not just a couple of warnings. There are warnings from outside scientists. There are warnings from scientists inside Duke. There are warnings from people who are intimately familiar with the actual research underlying these predictors, including co-authors on the papers.
That sounds like a lot of people raising flags. What were they warning about?
So the first big challenge came from these two guys in Texas, these two biostatisticians in Texas named Keith Baggerly and Kevin Coombs. These guys work at MD Anderson Cancer Center. It's a specialized cancer hospital in Houston, and their colleagues want to make their own. They want to figure out how to do this and help their patients with the same technology. So they're basically trying to reverse engineer these Duke algorithms. People talk about reproducibility in science, right? This is the premise that a robust scientific finding should be replicable by other researchers in other labs at other institutions. So they're basically trying to do that, but it doesn't work. The numbers don't add up. No matter how they try to run the analysis, they just can't figure out how you could get the level of accuracy that the Duke team claims to have. So they start corresponding with the two lead researchers at Duke, Joe Nevins and Anil Poti, to kind of explain their methods, and they never really get the answers they need to make it make sense. So they start publishing some of their findings, and they'll start trickling up to Duke leadership. And some scientists inside Duke start seeing these, like a letter to the editor that Baggerly and Coombs have published, and kind of knocking on their colleagues' doors and saying, hey, you should pay attention to this. It looks like there's a controversy here.
So this research has gone from an idea to clinical studies, and already early on there were issues that were noticed. Is that sort of controversy common?
So there's often disputes in science. There's often methodological debates in science. That's kind of just how science works. One team puts forward a finding or hypothesis, and another team knocks it down. And that's kind of the messy, dialectic way that science advances towards truth, or should be. So Sally Kornbluth, who was a dean at Duke Medical School at this time, and some of her colleagues said that we understood this to just be that, to just be a run-of-the-mill methodological controversy among scientists hashing it out. And that's what's supposed to happen. Okay. But then something much stranger happened. A whistleblower came forward from inside the lab. There was a third-year medical student at Duke named Brad Perez. And he was this really enthusiastic, really bright kid who got a prestigious fellowship to spend a year in the lab of Anil Poti, the main researcher behind these discoveries. Poti is going to put him on a paper as a lead author. And that's a paper that's going to end up, presumably, in a top medical research journal.
Wow, that's a huge deal.
It's a huge deal for a medical student, not a resident, a third-year medical student, doesn't even have a medical degree. So he's really excited, and he writes the paper as he's instructed to write it. He writes down their methods, how they did the work, and Poti says, that's too much of that. We don't want to describe our methods in such detail. And he doesn't really understand why, but he does what he's told and pares back the methods. Okay, that's weird. But then he starts getting more suspicious, and he starts looking into the lab's data. And he starts finding, in a way, what the two statisticians in Texas had, which is that the numbers don't look right. There's discrepancies in the data set. Some of the numbers don't line up. And he gets really alarmed, enough that he confronts his mentor, Poti, and Poti's mentor, Joe Nevins. I mean, this is a little fish going up to two big stars. And he says, I'm really worried about what I found here. Can you explain this to me? Can you make it make sense? And they brush him off. They say, oh, you know what? You have identified a couple of clerical errors. These are easily correctable mistakes. Thank you for bringing them to our attention, but you're mistaken. Nothing's actually amiss here. And he's not satisfied. So he takes some extraordinary steps. He leaves the lab. He demands that his name not be included as an author on any papers coming out of the lab. This is an unheard of step for a medical student to take. He's walking away from huge honors and huge career advancement for nothing. Then he goes a step further and writes this scathing, detailed memo about his concerns and distributes it to Duke deans.
Oh my God. What did the memo say?
He wrote at one part of this memo, "By continuing to work in this manner, we are doing a great disservice to ourselves, to the field of genomic medicine, and to our patients." Now, remember, there's clinical trials underway as he's writing this memo. There are real cancer patients having their actual cancer treatment guided by these predictors that Brad Perez believes are flawed. And he says, "As I learn more and more about how analysis is performed in our lab, the stress of knowing these problems exist is overwhelming." And then he goes one step further and expresses his deep skepticism in the trustworthiness of the researchers. And he said those data sets should be obtained from their respective sources through channels that bypass the researchers. I mean, this is a clear statement that he doesn't trust these guys, and he doesn't think Duke leaders should either.
So he's saying that someone should look at this and not take these guys' words for it.
Yes.
Wow. So did Anil Podi's reputation suffer any professional damage from that?
No. Not much happened. Brad Perez left the lab quietly. Hardly anybody outside of a small circle of Duke deans knew about this. And Podi was celebrated. Podi is a star. Podi is publishing some of the most compelling, exciting research coming out of Duke. People think he might win a Nobel Prize. Duke is featuring him in TV commercials with lab technicians in the background talking about how his genomic predictor technology could revolutionize cancer therapy.
So what happens next? What did Kornbluth do at this point?
So Sally Kornbluth knew about the Brad Perez concerns, but she was not in charge of figuring out what to do with the Brad Perez concerns. She wasn't in charge of launching or not launching an investigation on the basis of his concerns. She said in a deposition that she didn't read his memo. She didn't actually read the content of his memo until about a year later. But at the time, she knew that this medical student had come forward, and she knew that maybe his concerns were related to those of the Texas scientist Baggerly and Coombs. And then months later, she's a dean at Duke Medical School. She's giving a tour to 2 prospective donors, and she takes the donors to Anil Podi's lab. She calls it a show and tell and introduces him as this bright young star. He's this charming guy. I mean, everyone is charmed by Anil Podi.
So even though this memo had come out and this guy was in a commercial and giving lab tours, what happens next? Does it just go away?
No. So Baggerly and Coombs, the Texas statisticians, are getting more alarmed, not less, the more they look at this. And they're also getting frustrated that Duke doesn't seem to be seriously engaging with what they're saying. So they take an aggressive next step. They write and publish a whole peer-reviewed journal article describing all of the problems they have found in the Duke algorithms. In that paper, they say, these algorithms may be harming patients. That's a serious allegation, and they made it in an academic journal. Statisticians at the National Cancer Institute are aware of the Baggerly and Coombs critiques, and they're also aware of their own problems. They've been scrutinizing the Nevins-Podi research for some time also, and they've found problems themselves. So they write to Duke in an email that gets forwarded to Sally Kornbluth, and they say there are serious issues that we have found, and we are disturbed by what is happening here, especially as it relates to the clinical trials. Around the time of those warnings, Sally Kornbluth has a new role and much greater responsibility over this controversy in particular. It's almost an accident the way she ended up in that place. She had previously been the dean of basic science, which means lab science that doesn't involve humans. She's a cell biologist, but the dean of clinical research left, and she assumed that person's portfolio. So now she's overseeing clinical research too, just at the time when this controversy is accelerating. Another thing that happens is her boss, Nancy Andrews, who is now on the board of MIT, has to recuse herself. Nancy Andrews is the dean of Duke Medical School, and her husband, just by happenstance, is collaborating with Joe Nevins on an unrelated research project, so she has to step away. So that leaves Sally Kornbluth as the point person inside Duke Medical School overseeing the response to this scandal. So she and other Duke leaders make a decision at that point. They suspend enrollment in the clinical trials, right? The clinical trials are going. A bunch of patients are already having their chemotherapy guided by the predictors. But the Duke leaders decide, okay, since these challenges exist, and since there has been this accusation of potential patient harm, we're not going to let new patients join the trials until we figure out what's going on here. So they hire 2 outside statisticians and they say, okay, these 2 people will review the Nevins-Pody research. They're independent, they're unbiased, and they'll tell us if this is all okay or if the critics are onto something. In Texas, Baggerly and Coombs know that this external review is happening, and they're happy that that's happening. I think this might clean it up. But they keep doing what they've been doing, which is basically scientific detective work.
And did they find something else from that detective work?
So one night in early November 2009, Baggerly is trawling the website of the Duke lab, and he finds something new. There's a new data set posted on the website, and he clicks on it and opens it, and it's the thing he's been looking for 2 years. It is a key data set that he has wanted, that he hasn't been able to get, that shows how they got from point A to point C. It's the B in the middle that helps him make sense of how they could get to the findings they got to. And it's really bad. People describe what he found in that data set as a smoking gun. It shows that the numbers were manipulated to make it look like the predictors worked. And it's basically the closest thing he's found to unimpeachable proof that something has gone horribly awry here. He writes up his findings and he sends Sally Kornbluth an email, and he tries to write it as clearly as he can. His big point is like, these are not methodological statistical issues. These are just data that are not faithfully represented. So he writes this email. It's kind of technical, but he says, the sample labels are wrong, the gene labels are wrong, something else is wrong, and they're all wrong in a way that can lead to patients being assigned the wrong treatment. And he hits send. And his assumption is that his report will reach the external reviewers. The external reviewers will see it and realize that the science is not sound, and Duke will shut down the trials.
And did that happen?
And that's not what happened. So this is probably the most controversial and contested episode in this whole ordeal. It's what Duke did with Baggerly's November 9th report. In retrospect, it is pretty widely acknowledged that if only they had taken it seriously, given it to the external reviewers, there's no way that they could have allowed these trials to continue. But they didn't give it to their outside experts. It circulated among Duke leaders. It reached Joe Nevins, who was the senior scientist in charge of this research, and he strongly objected. He said this was insidious. He said it was unethical. He said Baggerly and Coombs were out of control. And he said it would be outrageous and that it would bias the investigation if Duke leaders shared Baggerly's report with the outside experts. And the CEO of Duke University Health System, Victor Zhao, said, I agree with Joe. We're not going to give it to them.
So the external review investigators got the data set from the researchers directly and not this new one.
That's exactly right. The researchers themselves selected the data that went to the outside reviewers.
Wow.
So a few weeks later, Sally Kornbluth and another Duke dean, Michael Cuff, announced that their external review has come back clean. The science is sound. All is well. We have heard the concerns. We've looked into them. And our outside experts have validated this pioneering science. And we're now going to reopen enrollment in the clinical trials. New patients may once again join.
Oh my God. So yeah, let's talk about those patients for a second. Had you talked to any of them before?
Yeah. So I have spoken with family members of patients. And, there's one story in particular that, that we tell at some length in our article. And this is a story of Juliet Jacobs. There's something really poignant and tragic about the timing of her story. So as this is all playing out, Juliet Jacobs, 69-year-old from Chapel Hill, is diagnosed with lung cancer, stage 4 lung cancer, and not given a lot of time to live. I mean, she doesn't think she's going to make it through the year. And she and her husband, Walter, are scouring the country looking for their best shot, right? They're talking to a star surgeon in Boston. They're looking for experimental treatments funded by the government. They're looking at specialized hospitals. They say, we don't want standard of care treatment. We want the silver bullet. And they're trying to find it. And they end up at Duke. And they end up at Duke just a couple of weeks after Sally Kornbluth and Michael Cuff announce that the review has come back clean and that we're reopening the trials to new patients. And Walter and Juliet Jacobs don't know any of this. They don't know there's a huge controversy surrounding this research that they're about to walk into. They just walk into an exam room and they meet Anil Poti, and he is young and charming and a star, and he's got the goods. He's got the algorithm that can guide Juliet's treatment and extend or save her life, or that's what they think. She enrolls in the trial. She has this pretty brutal biopsy where they have to plunge a needle into her lung and extract some tissue from the tumor so that then they can test it and run it through these algorithms. And then the algorithm assigns her to chemotherapy. Of course, this is all bogus. The algorithm doesn't work. It is a random number generator, but they don't know that. And her chemotherapy is selected by this bogus algorithm. And she dies a few months later. She dies in May. Now, did the algorithm kill her? No. Did the treatment selected by the algorithm kill her? No. Her lung cancer killed her. But she squandered her last chance. She squandered her final shot on a bogus technology instead of pursuing a legitimate technology, instead of pursuing legitimate treatment or experimental treatment somewhere else.
We'll be right back.
I'm Brendan McCarthy, the Globe's Spotlight editor. Spotlight is the longest-running investigative team in the United States. We're perhaps best known for the investigation into sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, but that is just one of many important investigations over the years. The team has also uncovered stories about the FBI's special relationship with notorious gangster Whitey Bulger and the untimely death of New England Patriots star Aaron Hernandez. It takes a lot of time to do investigative work like this. And if you believe in local journalism and holding power to account, please consider subscribing to the Boston Globe. There's a link in the show notes.
Wow. So, knowing the real human cost of fraud like this, how is that playing out after this external review comes clean with Sally Kornbluth and the National Cancer Institute and all the people that are raising these flags? How are they responding to this clean bill of health from this external review?
So Baggerly and Coombs are basically defeated by this point. The whistleblower has moved to another lab and is repeating a year of medical school. The inside critics have basically been frustrated. There are more outside scientists raising concerns, and they don't really know what else to do. But there's one more person in the wings, and this is a statistician at the National Cancer Institute named Lisa McShane, and she doesn't let it go. She has been scrutinizing Nevins and Poti's research literally for years. Going back to 2005 or 2006, she had found what she thought were discrepancies in their work. But her focus on this really ramped up in 2009. And when she sees the external review come back clean and the trials reopen to patients, she is disturbed. So there's a weird but actually really consequential wrinkle that happens here. And that is that back in 2009, when the National Cancer Institute first weighed in, they were just worried. They were just a concerned third party saying, this doesn't look right. We're worried that patients might be in danger here, and we'd really like you to do something about it. But that was it. They were just a worried party. And then something really random and strange happens in the spring of 2010, where they basically discover that, unbeknownst to them, they are funding one of these trials. And Poti had not properly disclosed that fact. So National Cancer Institute grant money is flowing through Poti's lab and into one of these trials.
So the National Cancer Institute isn't just a concerned neutral party here. Now they actually have a vested interest. So what's their reaction to finding that out?
So one thing is that the National Cancer Institute is pissed. They didn't know they were funding one of these trials they're so worried about. But the other thing is, oh, we have power now. We're not just a third party. We're a funder. We have actual authority over these trials. And that's where Lisa McShane really gets going. Now she's not just requesting data, she's demanding it. Anil Poti has to answer her questions. And she spends this entire spring just kind of ruthlessly extracting information from him. I've seen their emails. She's just like, I need these 30 lines of data now. Turn them over. And, he's kind of evasive in the way he responds to her questions and her emails. So she just gets like super minute and she just extracts what she needs from him bit by bit. And eventually she's basically reconstructed a lot of his research and it doesn't work. It still doesn't work. That spring is really interesting because Sally Kornbluth knows what's happening. Her colleagues know what's happening. They know Lisa McShane is on the case. And they're mad. They're mad that Lisa McShane won't let this go. She says in her deposition testimony that at the time, I thought Lisa McShane was acting like a dog with a bone. Now Sally Kornbluth knows Lisa McShane was right. But at the time, she was frustrated and she was mad. She thought Lisa McShane was biased. She even told Nevins and Poti that she was going to ask to have her removed from the case.
Whoa.
Yeah. She told, she wrote to Joe Nevins and Anil Poti and said, I think McShane is biased and I'm going to ask the National Cancer Institute to remove her and give us a different statistician. I mean, they're like, we already did it. We already checked it all out. It's fine. These people need to leave us alone. This has now been going on for years. Challenges to this work. The critics thinking, okay, this time I finally got them. This time they'll finally shut down the trials. And eventually what happens is Sally Kornbluth actually says to Lisa McShane, we should get together in person. And a contingent of Duke officials, including Kornbluth, Joe Nevins, and Anil Poti, go to Rockville, Maryland, go to the National Cancer Institute's campus and sit down in a conference room with Lisa McShane. And Lisa McShane tears Poti apart. It's an interrogation. She has a presentation that shows his data changing over time. She grills him about his data, and when he gives answers that are evasive, she pulls out his own words and reads them back to him. Sally Kornbluth is watching this, astonished, and she says in her deposition later, she nailed him to the wall. It was like something out of a TV show. And at the end of this meeting, the National Cancer Institute says to Duke, you guys have one more chance. You haven't answered our questions today. You have 2 weeks to prove this works. And if it doesn't, we're shutting you down. So the Duke team goes back to Duke. They tell one of their internal statisticians, Bill, figure this out. Get the data we need to prove this all works. They give him 2 weeks. And while that's happening, the other shoe drops.
Another shoe drops? What happens this time?
There's this newsletter. It's called the Cancer Letter that's been writing about this case for coming up on a year at this point. And it publishes a bombshell report which says that Anil Poti has lied on his resume. He claimed to be a Rhodes Scholar on his resume, and he isn't one.
Whoa.
And it wasn't the only misrepresentation on his resume. And that was the final straw. The whole thing unraveled after that. Now, what Sally Kornbluth says is like, yeah, well, this was a really complicated scenario. There was contradictory information. We were trusting in our guys. It was all about statistical methods. There was no explicit allegation of data fraud. But then when this happened, when we were told that he had lied on his resume, that changed everything. Now we have a reason not to trust anything he says. The critics see this a different way, which is, why did multiple years of challenges to the scientific research not break through? But then the thing that finally got Duke to act was a revelation that Poti had lied about something that actually has no bearing on these clinical trials or cancer treatment at all. That was the final straw. They shut down the trials. They put Poti on leave. And then there was a reckoning.
What was that reckoning?
Well, I said that they had assigned this statistician, Bill Barry, to, find the data that makes it work. Well, his assignment changed now. Now do a forensic investigation to figure out what went wrong here, which he does. And he opens up all the books. He looks at the original data. He looks at the intermediate data. He looks at the published data. And then he reports back and says that he found misrepresentations and non-random mislabeling. These are gentle terms for fraud. So, there was a reckoning inside Duke over this. There were a lot of scientists inside Duke who started trying to piece together, like, wait a second, what did our leaders know and when? And there were some bad facts that came out. Like, one of the things that emerged was that this November 9th report from Baggerly existed. A lot of people didn't know that. Even this guy, Bill Barry, the statistician who ultimately does the final bit of research to prove the case, he didn't know about it. They didn't tell him, and he was working on the clinical trials, and he was furious. So there were a lot of recriminations inside Duke. And then there was a federal investigation a few years later that found that Pody had committed research misconduct, that he had introduced manipulated data into scientific papers, grant proposals, and the scientific record. Pody did not admit or deny wrongdoing to settle that case. Nevins, for his part, was never found to have engaged in research misconduct. He later said that he was deceived by someone he considered a close friend. And there was a lawsuit. There was a small number of surviving patients, and they sued, and relatives of patients who had not survived sued. And that lawsuit, which Duke settled for an undisclosed sum, dragged on for years and produced the documentary record that a lot of our story comes from.
So what do you think that says, especially right now in this moment when the Trump administration and RFK Jr. are deeply skeptical of science and scientific institutions and attacking universities and withholding scientific research grants? What does a scandal like this do to the trust of an institution like that?
Yeah, so one of the reasons I was attracted to the story was actually the fact that it occurred 15 years ago. I mean, research misconduct isn't new. It shows how persistent these problems are, right? There were data fraud scandals 10 years ago. There were data fraud scandals 5 years ago. There were data fraud scandals last year and this spring, right? This is a problem that the scientific establishment has never managed to stamp out. Now, it is a hard problem, right? The then dean of Duke Medical School, Nancy Andrews, who's now on the board of MIT and the chief scientific officer of Boston Children's Hospital, she told me, look, you can have all the policies in the world, but if somebody really wants to deceive you, they're probably going to. And that's true, and that needs to be credited. But it doesn't change the fact that these kinds of scandals are deeply corrosive to trust in science, and that they make institutions profoundly vulnerable to attack. And to me, that's why a story like this really matters.
And there's also this idea that these institutions should be held to a higher standard of what truth finding is. The scientific method, that process is on a pedestal at these institutions, and rightfully so, because this is the process where we humans acknowledge that data and observations can be flawed and acknowledge that our hypotheses can be wrong. And then we go forward with an open mind to root out as much untruth or lies or fraudulent data or just surprising data as much as we can to get to the right answer or to the truth. And so when that can be so easily tainted, what does that say about the entire institution?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because, in a real way, the most valuable thing these institutions have, or really like the only thing these institutions have, is credibility. Their credibility to pursue and disseminate truth. What else are they possibly for? That's what they're for. They are there to mediate truth and discover truth and impart it to their students and to the public. Stories like this, and they're not that rare, unfortunately, just cut to the core of that credibility. And, you can have fair debates about, is it just the cost of doing business, right? When you're working on the frontiers of knowledge, when you're working with a lot of ambitious people, is there going to be some misconduct? Is there going to be some fraud around the edges? Okay, yeah, fine. It doesn't mean it isn't damaging, right? And it doesn't mean it isn't consequential. And, you can have all kinds of debates about what the Trump administration is up to, but a fact we can observe is that top officials in the Trump administration, including Jay Bhattacharya, the director of the National Institutes of Health, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the Secretary of Health and Human Services, they talk about the erosion of trust in science when they explain and justify Trump administration policies about scientific research. They talk about data fraud, both of them. Jay Bhattacharya talked about it in his Senate confirmation hearing. RFK talks about it when he talks about launching government-funded, government-sponsored peer-reviewed journals. These scandals matter, and they matter now more than ever. And that's why I wanted to do this, because this isn't a one-off, and it isn't even a 2025 problem only. It is a undercurrent in science that is having greater consequence today than ever.
Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jasmine.
In addition to reviewing court records and other investigative documents, Mike spoke with researchers, family members, and Duke administrators. He also reached out to Joe Nevins, Anil Poti, and Sally Kornbluth. Joe Nevins didn't respond to questions. Anil Poti declined to comment, and Sally Kornbluth declined a request for a sit-down interview and responded in writing to questions. In her response, she said that Duke leaders' response to controversy was, quote, a slow and deliberative process, perhaps too slow and deliberative in the eyes of some, complicated by the active and ongoing deception of the perpetrator. Since this story published, Sally Kornbluth issued a statement saying, quote, at the time, I was new to university administration. Lessons learned from this case have powerfully shaped my approach to leadership ever since. Mike Damiano covers higher education for the Boston Globe. His story was edited by Annalisa Quinn, Francis Storrs, and Mark Morrow. Please read his full story in this week's Globe magazine and subscribe to the Boston Globe to support our journalism. There's a link in the show notes. This episode was produced by Jasmine Aguilera and edited by Kristen Nelson. Special thanks to Ann Lee. I'm Jasmine Aguilera. Thanks for listening.